Hello. Welcome to Integrated Wellbeing YouTube channel and podcast for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We provide education, inspiration, and practical tools by interviewing those bereaved by loss, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Integrated Wellbeing Institute seeks to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of their body. I'm Georgina Grace, the director of the Institute, and it is my delight today to welcome Dr. Kay Fontana, who is the founder of Healing Our Grieving Hearts and certified life force coach and grief recovery specialist. For more than 18 years, she's worked as a life coach and supported numerous individuals as a grief recovery specialist since 2015. And following the passing of her husband of 40 years in 2023, she recognized the significance of applying the tools she'd learned and had been trained in to facilitate her own healing journey. So Kay, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Well, thank you, Georgina. It is an honor to be here with you.
Well, tell me a little bit about you and Healing Our Grieving Hearts, please.
Well, as you had mentioned, I'm deeply familiar with the pain of loss and have experienced numerous heart-wrenching losses throughout my life. At just 9 years old, my brother, after turning 17 years old, died of cancer. And I witnessed my parents with this immense grief and dealing with his death. And then later on, many years later, my mother battled Alzheimer's and later ultimately passed in 2014, 5 days after I completed the grief recovery support group. And as part of my practitioner studies, my spiritual practitioner studies. And in 2019, my father was diagnosed of cancer and passed away a week later at the remarkable age of 96. And then, as you mentioned, my husband, last January 2023, he was my soulmate husband of 40 years, and due to multiple health issues, including diabetes, he passed away. Mm-hmm. And so, throughout these profound losses, as well as countless other losses that I've experienced, along with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, in-laws, and even coworkers and beloved pets, I discovered the power of healing and resilience. So in 2015, driven by my personal journey of grief, I became a grief recovery specialist and later focused on life force coaching, which together equipped me with the necessary tools to navigate the complexities of loss and help others find their own way.
Oh, what's your husband's name?
David.
David.
Or Dave. He wanted to be called Dave.
Dave. So what we know is they are never gone as long as we say their name.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Kay.
Thank you, Georgina.
Yeah. How did our Healing Our Grieving Hearts then come about?
Well, that is a very interesting story. And I owe it all to the grief recovery method and a very wise 16-year-old young man. So after my husband died last year, I wasn't really feeling called to continue my existing coaching work. And I was kind of in this, this kind of funk, of course, after losing a husband. Mm-hmm. And I really needed to get motivated to move forward. And then a friend of mine invited me to go to the 10-year memorial anniversary of the Granite Mountain hotshots who died in the Yarnell fire on June 30th of 2013. and there were 19 of them. Now, I wasn't sure if I was up to attending this event, but for some reason I was really called to go, so I did. And I'm so glad I did because they had a whole list of speakers at this event. It was at the Courthouse Square in Prescott, Arizona. And one of the speakers, who was by far the best one of all of them, was 16-year-old Ryder Ashcraft, who was 6 years old when his father, Andrew Ashcraft, died in the Yarnell fire. And this young man touched my heart so much with his inspiration and his words of hope that I came home and knew exactly what I needed to do. And that was to get back on the horse and help others through the grieving process. His speech was phenomenal.
And so then what you did is you established Healing Our Grieving Hearts, right? As a result of that.
Absolutely. I realized that this was my calling. I had been doing it for 10 years, and this is my calling, and I needed to get back to doing it.
Good. And you also mentioned earlier the life force coaching. What's that exactly?
Well, life force is that energy that flows through us, through all living things, and it keeps us alive, and it's really the foundation for my coaching practice. And the root of negative emotions is a disruption in our energy system. So the forms of healing that I use in my coaching practice are Qigong, Reiki, and also tapping, or emotional freedom technique, or EFT for short. Now, Qigong is a Chinese meditative martial art that literally means the movement that makes our life force energy work. And Reiki originated in Japan and translates to universal life force, life energy. And then the emotional freedom technique was created in 1990 by Gary Craig, and it's very similar to acupuncture or acupressure without needles, and utilizes points on our energy meridians to open the channels of that life force energy and allow it to flow. And that's according to ancient Chinese medicine. Now I'm a certified life force coach through the Satori method, which utilizes a combination of strengthening your physical and your energy bodies and changing your thought patterns to reach your goals and change your life. So, but it's also rooted in the practice of Qigong, and there's a long story about that. But I really believe that life force coaching and the use of energy healing modalities helps clients release those energetic blockages associated with grief. And they also promote relaxation and stress reduction, allowing individuals to really get through their emotions and that accompany grief.
Because what we know is grief lives in the body. We can't think our way through it.
That is absolutely right, Georgina.
Yeah. So tell me, please, what happens in one of your coaching sessions, Kay?
Oh, good question. So the first section is about getting to know the client and what their biggest challenges are and what they would like to see in their future. If it's grief related, then, how would they like things to be different? And, a lot of times in grief, we talk about the new normal, so what is that new normal look like for them? And it's a process of inquiry to get to the root of the issue, and which is often grief or a sense of purpose that they've lost since losing someone in their life. I try to, a lot of times grief brings up an opportunity to explore new purpose and passion in life. So if the client is ready to move forward, and that then we meet again to go into a much deeper level into their why. What would they like? and what is it that inspires them to go in that direction.
Uh-huh.
So, during the coaching session, I also integrate energy healing modalities, particularly Qigong and EFT, that I can do online, and during a session to unblock that disruption in their energy. And I found that these modalities work really well, whether in person or online, and it's a very transformational process for them.
That's really, really neat. In my book, I talk about the new now versus
Oh, yeah.
the new normal.
Right.
And also, it was interesting because what I'm imagining, and correct me if I didn't get it, but what you're doing with clients who are ready to explore moving forward is answering that question, who am I now?
Right, exactly. What is
Hmm.
their purpose? What is their passion?
Yes.
And what do they see? What is the gift that
Hmm.
they are getting from their experience? Because I
Yes.
think in every experience, whether it's positive or negative, even negative experiences, deep down, there's a gift in there that we have to reveal.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when we can dive deep and uncover that gift, the richness of the process, in my experience, even enhances that gift as we bring it up and really know, oh, this is mine. It's
Right.
like, I talk about my clients going into the diamond mind of their
Mhm.
being.
Oh, that's
And
beautiful.
it's dark in there,
Yeah.
and the light has to be very focused, but it
Mhm.
doesn't go very far, but that's okay. So
Right.
that's really, really neat.
Oh,
Well,
that's beautiful.
yeah. Okay. So often, people have heard the word coaching, but
Mhm.
what if they're not familiar with it? Is there a way to see if a coach is right for them?
Oh, absolutely. I offer a complimentary 30-minute grief breakthrough session where it's kind of a sampling of what a coaching session would look like, and it's much like what I mentioned before, finding out where they're at, what they want, and a little bit about their why. So it's completely free. They don't have to move forward if they don't want to, but it's a good opportunity to experience what a coaching session actually looks like, and to
Mhm.
find out if we're a good fit to work together.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really wonderful because not everyone does um, mesh. And
Right.
it's such an intimate journey to go with someone who is there companioning you as you're moving through grief. So
Absolutely.
that's really, really nice. I've done that too on the telephone and, taken people into their bodies. And if it feels like it's something that is a fit, then it's like, well, this will be very rich for both of us.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
so I'm glad. Isn't it wonderful now that we can work on the phone and online and in person?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I do all three. So,
Mhm.
I found that, particularly during COVID, that
Yes.
um, the opportunity to work one-on-one with somebody online was such a gift. And, it really opened up those possibilities where people didn't have to be in isolation, that they could actually communicate with people
Mhm.
online, without having to go to an office or go to anywhere to meet.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's there was actually a little bit of a gift in the COVID pandemic,
Yes.
is that it opened up opportunities for everyone to reach out.
Mhm. I have a question about you using Qigong in sessions. Do you demonstrate it and have people do it with you? Is that the way
Absolutely.
it works?
Yes, I do.
Oh,
Yes,
that's neat. And
and
then
it's
with
really easy to do online. So.
yes, yes, it's really fun. And then with the Reiki, do you just simply send the energy to where you're discerning where it needs to go?
Yes, and I probably primarily use Reiki in person,
Do
but I
you?
can do it online, yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes, the energy work in person, there's just nothing like it.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, yeah, it's just amazing. So, Kay, if someone were to come to you and specifically want to work on their grief, what would you recommend?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a grief recovery specialist. And if they specifically just wanted to work on the grief and some healing behind that, then
Hmm.
I would suggest the grief recovery method. Now, I offer 7 week program for individuals, either online or in person, and also 8 week um, programs for groups, either online or in person, either way. And during that time, the participant outlines a series of losses that they've experienced since the youngest memory that they had as a child. And during the process of the participant identifies one specific loss that they want to address. And then they complete a series of action steps that help them move beyond the pain caused by the loss, and thereby completing it all undelivered communications that accrued in that relationship. Now, the undelivered communication may be in the form of an apology,
Mm.
forgiveness statement, or a significant emotional statement where they basically just state how they felt about the event in the relationship that took place. So it's a very healing process because so many people have that unspoken communication. I wish I had said, I wish I had done, I wish they had said, or I wish they had done. And so it really brings together a completion of that undelivered communication.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned the grief recovery method. What is that, and how did you find that training?
Well, that's an interesting story because now back in 2013, my mom was at the ending stages of her Alzheimer's. And I was in practitioner studies as a licensed spiritual practitioner, and one of the modules was on death and dying, or grief and loss, or one, I
Hmm.
can't remember the exact name of it. But so we were required to read a book, and we were given a list and said, here's a list of books we want you to read, pick one from this list and then report on it, how this applies to you and your practitioner practice. And so I happened to pick the grief recovery method that was written by John W. James and Russell Friedman. Well, when I started reading the book, I could not put it down. It was so rich, and it was really meaningful. And I instantly, after finishing that book, it's like, wow, I really want to use this. I think this is so valuable. I want to be a grief recovery specialist, and, I wanted to find a class. And then it was recommended to me that someone that I knew actually was a facilitator of that program.
Mm.
So in January of 2014, I signed up for her program. The At that time, I think it was 8 weeks. And interestingly enough, we're in the program, you identify one loss that you want to heal. And mind you, there are over 40 types of losses that people can experience, which I can cover later. But so I chose to work on my mom because I really had lost her. With Alzheimer's, there was no communication. She had no idea who I was, or my sister either. And we knew that it wouldn't be long. We had really no idea how long she was going to hang on there, but she had been dealing with this for, several years. So I signed up for the program. And while I was in that program, we put my mom in hospice care. And then the program ended on Wednesday, February 19th, 2014, and my mother died on February 23rd, 5 days later, after I finished the program. And it was at that point when I realized how beneficial the program was for me in healing the loss of my mom, that I was certain that I needed to do this, and that I needed to pursue a certification to be able to offer this to other people. So the following year, I wasn't able to, there was one that was like that following July, but it was booked up. So I enrolled in the one in January of 2015. And so that's when I became a grief recovery specialist. And I've been doing that ever since.
And how long was that training then, Kay?
It was, I believe it was 3 or 4 days. And so it
intensity.
It was really intense, and a lot of tears and a lot of Kleenex, but it was a fabulous experience. And, so I've been doing this ever since then.
That's wonderful. Oh, it's so amazing, because I was excited that they wrote a second edition, an anniversary edition of the Grief Recovery Handbook.
Yes.
And when people can't come for grief support, even though they feel like they need some and are able to read a book, that's one of the top books that I recommend, because
absolutely.
It's just absolutely wonderful.
It is.
It really is. Well, thank you very, very much for sharing that. And isn't it interesting how the timing of that all happened? And
it is.
There are no accidents in many cases.
Everything is in divine right timing.
It is. It is. Sometimes that's hard for people to even imagine.
Yes.
And yet it is, when we can step back, that's one of those gifts in grief, that we can see when there's some distance very often between the event, and then we can go to a different place.
Absolutely.
Experience it, So I'm curious, what is the difference between grief and bereavement from your perspective, Kay?
Well, grief is actually that emotional reaction to loss. And while bereavement is actually the time period after a loss whereby, a person grieves and mourns. So a lot of times it's confused, between one or the other. But the grief is actually the emotional response, and the bereavement is actually that time period after the loss.
I've discovered from my clients 3 facets of grief. It's navigating the ocean of emotion.
Oh, yes.
And then grief brings up the deepest, darkest parts of ourselves, longing to be heard and healed. And then finally, what you and I discussed earlier is answering the question, or at least exploring it, who am I now?
Right. So,
and that bereavement period is going to be different for different people.
Right. Absolutely. Because every loss is different. Every person is different, and every experience is different. And we can never compare one loss to another, even though they may appear to be very similar, that everyone experiences loss in a different way.
I say to compare is to despair.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah. And I have been using, Kay, grief and grieving in place of mourning. Mourning is kind of an old word.
Right.
And so I've been saying that, and it's nice to see your face light up, because I imagine that it works for you as well.
Right. Absolutely. I don't ever use mourning. I use the word mourning always, if you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves. So I don't know if any of our listeners have ever watched it, but that word triggers a visualization of that movie. But I always use grief and grieving.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned there's a saying that time heals all wounds. Is that really true from your perspective?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that because, I have known people that have been grieving for 10, 20, 30, even 40 years without
Mm,
ever healing. And they were really unaware that they were still grieving or that the loss had been tucked away. Um, and, you know, tucked away down in their baggage that they were carrying around. We use an analogy of a backpack that we're all born with this backpack, and and every time we experience a loss, we kind of tuck it away. And there's many reasons for that because a lot of times people don't want to hear about their loss anymore. They think, well, you've been grieving for 2 months now. It's time to move on. And thereby you think that you should be over it,
mhm.
or they just don't have the tools or resources to address the problem, so they kind of tuck it away in that backpack. And then over time, and grief can be experienced at a very young age. Um, so as every time they experience a loss, they tuck it away in this backpack until it just gets really heavy and overwhelming. So no, time does not heal all wounds. That completion of that communication can help people move forward, but time definitely doesn't heal
Mhm.
all wounds.
Well, and with the people I work with, particularly in suicide bereavement support
Oh,
group,
yes.
really, really resent that
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, really, you just expect this to change.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's very, very upsetting to them.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. And
Hmm.
that's actually one of the myths um, that the grief recovery handbook explains. There are 6 myths, and one of them is that time heals all wounds. And another one, grieve alone. And people think that after the funeral is over and after everything is said and done, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to leave you to your space. You can have it, take care of this by yourself. And then the other, two more, don't feel bad and replace the loss. And this happens when especially in childhood, that if a child experiences a loss, then there's a sense that people need to replace that loss. And John W. James in the Grief Recovery Handbook explains a time when he was a child and he was 5 years old, and his dog ran away or died. I can't remember. And so after a while, seeing that John was suffering the grief and loss of his dog, said, don't feel bad. We'll get you another puppy on Saturday. And
Hmm.
so there's that sense of replacing that loss. And I remember that vividly when I was 3 years old. And it's funny, I went all this time. I've been doing this for 10 years. And just a few weeks ago, I was working with a client and her loss history graph. And I thought, oh my gosh, I just remembered something that I hadn't thought about in years. And it was a time when I was 3 years old and I had this doll called Baby Move. And my parents saw on the news that the doll was flammable. And so they urged all parents whose children had this doll to return it to the fire department to be disposed of. And so I remember my parents handing that over to the fire department. And then my mom bought me another doll to replace it. And I was not happy with it. I didn't like it. I wanted my Baby Move back. And so people don't understand that sometimes these losses start at a very early age, but
Hmm.
they're not taken seriously because they're children. But
Hmm.
children experience significant losses when they're young. So
Oh, yes, yes. That is a powerful story.
Yes.
And yes, because when I remember my first loss was my dog Lady, and we
Oh.
lived on an acreage, and my parents entrusted her to the vet to be spayed, and he gave her too much anesthetic, and she never came out of it.
Oh no.
And so she was the beginning of our pet cemetery.
Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
And pets,
Hmm.
beloved pets are very, very challenging. I mean, I remember when our dog died, and this is, my husband and I had our dog for almost 12 years, and we were devastated by that loss.
Hmm.
It was because that dog was family. And
Hmm.
so I can imagine. How old were you at that time?
I was 5, and I
5.
still love that picture of me in a pinafore playing with Lady.
Oh
It's
my gosh.
it's one of those old black and white photos, but the
Oh,
joy that's there
yes.
and the love that's there. I
Right.
really, really loved that dog.
Oh my gosh.
She was just so wonderful. There are many people, Kay, that call me, and we work through their grief of their four-leggeds.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And the Grief Recovery Institute, they actually, John W. James and Russell Freeman actually wrote a book on pet loss.
Oh,
And
good.
so that's another program that is offered that I can offer people is specifically on pet loss, because
Oh, good.
there's so much around, losing a pet, because they're like your family.
Yeah.
And they're so special.
They love us unconditionally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the difference, I believe, between them and us. We can
Hmm.
have a little judgment or a
Right.
lot,
Yeah.
and they simply don't. They just don't.
Right. They're
And
just,
they pick up on our energy. I
oh, they
remember
do.
after my son Reed died, our beagle
Oh,
Sarah, about 6 months later, developed lupus.
oh my.
And that autoimmune, I just believe, she was soaking up our grief.
Oh
And
my.
so 2 years later, after Reed died, then we had to have her put to sleep and
Oh,
cremated, and her ashes are under the tree right next to Reed's grave.
oh my
So that's, yeah,
goodness.
that's really a sweet story of Sarah, our beagle. Oh,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
I'm so
yeah.
sorry about your loss too.
Thank you. Well, and I've never heard of the doll that you talked about.
Oh,
Baby
really?
Boo?
Baby move. Like,
Moo.
yeah, I guess
Got
it
it.
did some things that I don't know. That was many years ago,
Hmm.
60 years ago. So I don't
Hmm.
even really remember the doll. I just
Sure.
remember the incident. You know,
Yes.
it's like, we have
Yes.
to give this to the fire department or our house is going to burn down or something.
Wow. That's
Like,
really, really something. And
yeah,
that's one of those deep pieces of inner child work
right.
that often come up when we're
Yes,
working with grieving people.
absolutely.
So, one of the things that I'm curious about is for you to talk to us about unresolved grief, because no one that I've interviewed has mentioned that.
Okay. Well, unresolved grief is cumulative and cumulatively negative. And this goes back, as I mentioned, losses from years ago that were never ever healed or resolved. People hanging on to that back backpack full of losses that they've never come to terms with, and just felt like they had to stuff it away. Um,
Hmm.
because for one, maybe people didn't want to hear about it anymore, or they just didn't have the resources to deal with it, or didn't know how to access resources to deal with it. So,
Hmm.
as we go through life, we just keep tucking those away and putting them away until a later time. And the interesting thing about unresolved grief is that it can actually lead to mental health issues, to suicide, even incarceration. And as those feelings and emotions are expressed through anger, that can lead with dealings with the law.
Hmm.
Now, when I was a teacher, back in the day, I worked with kids in the juvenile justice system. And these kids in my program came generally from broken homes. So they experienced many facets of grief. And the males in the program, and a few of the females too, were associated with local gangs. And now, what is it that these kids are looking for when they join a gang? It's connection, it's family, and belonging. And so all of these things that they don't get from a broken home. And so, of course, being part of a gang suffices all those things that are missing in their personal life. So, these kids are going through life with unresolved grief. Their parents are in jail, or they're living with extended family members, or there's multiple family members all in one home, and they just don't have that connection, that intense, that family, that closeness of family, and that belonging. So I would say that relation, those types of relationships and those situations really exhibit that unresolved grief that people can experience in life. And now, not everyone is going to join a gang or get involved with the law, but there's some real value in understanding that, when it comes to people that are in the justice system.
That's really interesting. No one's spoken of that since we began this podcast YouTube series.
Wow.
And so that's a very, very profound learning that you're sharing with us. And I really appreciate that a lot. I also appreciate you saying that there are 40 different types of losses according to the grief recovery program.
Yes.
And I'm curious if there are maybe 10 of those that are so unique that you'd like to share them with us, if you have any that just pop up.
Absolutely. And aside from death or divorce or separation, there's loss of health, loss of finances, loss of a life once lived. And, which I think that I was dealing with that with my husband, because he had been ill for several years. And so I was grieving the life that we used to have, of fun, doing things together and enjoying life. There's also retirement or forced retirement, or the loss of a career, like a career ending injury, like let's say a football player who's in the NFL, who has been playing football for years and then has a career ending injury and has to retire from the one thing, the love of his life, which is, playing football. So, there's also disability, loss of home, loss of family with dementia, and there's also loss of faith. People can lose faith because they, and which can be in any type of loss. It can be included in any type of loss, but people often blame a higher power for their loss, whether it's a death or divorce or, whatever, that they blame a higher power for their experience, and then therefore lose faith. And so, it's very, there's so many more, but
there are.
That's, that's kind of the crux of the whole thing, is that there's so many ways that people can grieve.
And it's very interesting because so often people don't realize that they are in grief.
Exactly.
And which brings me to our next question: can people heal from a loss on their own?
Well, that's a good question, because, as I mentioned, every loss is different and everyone grieves different. Every experience is different. And, with 40 different types of losses, you can imagine that over a lifetime, we all experience many.
Do.
And if we are all, tucking away those losses in a backpack, then, as I mentioned, after 10 years of doing this, I completely thought about my doll when I was 3 years old. So unless they have a very, unless they have someone to work with them through the grieving process, it's probably unlikely that they can heal all of their losses, from on their own. And I would say that taking a step to work with somebody that can help reveal some of those losses and address it and address the completion of the communication around that relationship or that situation or whatever, I think would be very valuable. But overall, when you're thinking about this backpack full of losses, it would probably be unlikely that they could do it on their own. I couldn't. I didn't do it on my own. So.
Well, it's very useful to have someone who's empathetic, skilled, and there as a professional mirror, a reflective mirror that can validate one's experience. And I think that's really a beneficial, and grief researchers say, George Bonanno has said, people can heal on their own, and healthy grief is 2 years. And it's interesting to hear those things from the professionals. I'd love to interview him someday here on this program. And simply because, so many of the people that come to see me certainly need that companioning, and they're more than 2 years out in their loss.
Because there is no timeline on.
That's right.
None. There is none. And you can't compare one to another. It's so vastly different.
So I'm so happy that you brought to us today the grief recovery method. And I'm curious, how is this program different from other grief support groups? And because it can be done individually, I know.
Absolutely. It can be done individually, and it's just as effective individually as it is in a group. So, many, and I'm not familiar with all types of support groups, but many support groups are designed to, get around a circle and discuss their losses and share ideas. And oftentimes it leads to comparison of, well, my grief, I experienced this and well, I did too. And, it ends up in more of a conversation of trying to fix each other. But the grief recovery method provides correct action choices that help people move through the pain caused by loss. And, individually, it's a 7-week program, or in a group, it's an 8-week program, because when you get multiple people in there, it takes a little bit longer. So it creates a safe environment for people to look at old beliefs about dealing with loss and completing that undelivered communication that keeps us stuck in grief for years. And, that completion may be an apology. I'm sorry that I didn't do this, or I'm sorry I didn't say that. It could be forgiveness. You did this years ago, but I forgive you for it, and I'm ready to move forward. Or some significant emotional statements like, when you did this, it really hurt, or when you did this, I was so happy that you did that. It made me feel so good. So, and the other thing about grief support groups is that, they typically meet weekly, but they're very fluid. People come in, they go out, and there's no consistency about who's in the group. Whereas in the grief recovery method, it's very set. It's a schedule, once a week for 7 weeks for an individual, or 8 weeks for a group, and everybody participates for those 8 weeks if it's a group. So it's, it's very effective because there's a beginning and the end, and there's a process.
Yes.
And we
Mhm.
don't try to fix anybody because we know that they're not broken.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm. So that it's a closed group then,
Yes,
which
it
is
is a closed
wonderful.
group. Yes.
Mhm. And I really like that. We talked about the different grief support groups and the benefits of them in one program specifically. And I loved the closed model because there can be such safety and greater depth
Right.
in my experience as a facilitator.
Right, exactly. Because we're bound to confidentiality,
Yes.
and we're bound to being open and honest.
Mhm.
Honesty and confidentiality are two of the key things that we focus on at the beginning of every meeting. We go through our commitments, to
Good.
be open and honest, and to have total confidentiality. What's spoken in there stays there.
hmm hmm I like the open and honest because that
Mhm.
sets an expectation and it also gives permission.
Right. Right.
hmm as part of
Absolutely.
the opening and ground rules. I'm not so sure I like that term. It seems very old and outdated,
Yeah.
but our guidelines
Yeah.
for
And we
that
call
kind
them
of thing.
commitments, that they're
I like
committed.
that.
Yeah, they're
hmm
committed. The commitments are, that that you're here,
You come
you
on time, it ends on
yeah,
time, some
right.
things like that. But
Mhm.
you're open and honest, and what's said
Right.
here stays here.
Exactly. Because they can't experience that level of healing if they're not honest with themselves about the experience, or honest with
Yes.
everything else. And if
hmm
they're still hiding some things, then
hmm
that are still in that backpack, then we
Yes.
really need to dump that backpack out and get all that
hmm
stuff out in order to heal it, because it's so important.
It
And some
is.
people have a difficult time looking at, if it's a really negative relationship, like, a divorce or separation, they
hmm
tend to look at all the negative things in the relationship. But we try to, um, you know, we encourage them to reveal some of those positive things as well about that person. And the same with, someone who you were, devoted to, and, the love of your life. It's like, every relationship has ups and downs. So,
It does.
you have to
hmm
bring those negative things to surface too. You can't just
hmm
hide those.
hmm
So it's
Yeah.
so important.
The shadow work. It has
Right.
to come out of the shadows and be seen. And I loved a word that you used earlier when we were talking about can people heal from loss on their own? We reveal. And
Right.
that's what we do
Right.
as that professional support is, oh, I heard you saying, and I'm curious if, and then it can reveal something deeper.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Shine
Kate,
those shine those things in the light.
that's exactly right. Put your headlamp on and go after it. That's for
Right.
sure. Well, Kay, what other programs do you offer?
Well, like I had mentioned, that the grief recovery method has a pet loss program, and it also has a program called Helping Children with Grief. Now, that program is not for children, it's for adults who are experience grief. And that book was written actually prior to the Columbine shooting. And so then it was published shortly after, because they realized that there was such a need to help children, moving through loss. So that's a fabulous book too. And then, of course, my life force coaching. My life force coaching is actually the umbrella of everything. And then I bring those programs into my practice.
Okay. I was really intrigued about the communication program that you have, continuing communication with someone after they've died. And maybe I misunderstood when we were talking, but I thought that that was like a 7-week individual program to continue those bonds after someone has died.
No, it's actually, what it is that That communication is the apologies, forgiveness,
Oh,
and
okay.
significant emotional statements that,
Okay.
it's a process that we move through to really get to the whole relationship as a whole, from the very
Okay.
start to the very
Mm-hmm.
finish,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I used it on myself with, when my husband passed away. And so there's 40 years in there of, the positive, the negative, and everything in between. So you really look deep into that whole relationship and
Okay.
complete that communication that you never went through, that you never
Got it.
delivered or
Okay.
received what during that relationship.
Thank you for that extra
Yeah,
clarification from
not a
me.
problem.
Well, and that's really, I believe that until, and have observed that until that is done, a person then can't say, okay, now what?
Right.
And move forward with freedom.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I used to say, um, grief never ends, it becomes different. I
Right.
now say, well, grief is there and we grow around it.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
We do. It'll always be there.
Yes.
And the programs are never meant to wipe that memory away, or
Right.
to say that relationship never exists. It just
Mm-hmm.
allows somebody to look at it in a new light
Yes.
and discover where they need to go and discover
Mm-hmm.
their own purpose in life
Mm-hmm.
without that individual. So yeah, you're right. You grow
Mm-hmm.
around that relationship or that
Yes.
loss.
Well, the Institute's new paradigm of grief, K, is you're not broken by this loss, you're broken open like a seed to root down into
Yes.
self-awareness and grow in new connections. And that's what I heard you saying just now,
Mhm.
is there's this completion and now the new connection and the new level of consciousness, the new lens of looking and experiencing the relationship.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That was beautiful what you just said. That was a beautiful
Mm,
statement. So I
yeah,
love that.
thank you. Well, I want our audience to know how they can get in touch with you. How can people get in touch with you, Kay?
Well, that would be wonderful. So you can go to my website. It is www.healingourgrievinghearts.com.
Okay.
And you can find out more about me and my programs and upcoming events. And you can also go to the Contact Me page on my website and sign up for a 30-minute grief breakthrough session. It's a free, the one that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
You can also email me at kay at healingourgrievinghearts.com. And I also have a Facebook page, Healing Our Grieving Hearts. So you can reach me in many different ways, but I would love to hear from you, to see how I can help and, open up that seed and
That's
plant some
right.
new roots.
That's right. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute joy to have you here today. Your presence and the love that you bring, as well as the expertise and wisdom, is certainly why we invite people like you to be guests, because our audience is varied. There are people who feel like they're moving through and beyond their grief, but they simply want to learn more. There are others that are in that raw grief or fragile grief, and this is a lifeline for them. So I can't thank you enough for saying yes to our invitation and being here with us today.
Well,
So
thank you so much, Georgina. It has
you're
been a
welcome.
true honor to meet with you today. And I am so excited about what you do. You do some amazing work. So thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show.
You're welcome. And then everything about Kay, her headshot, her bio, and then these contacts that she's given us will be listed below these interviews. So please, please avail yourself of this wonderful person and her expertise. So until we meet again, thank you for joining us, and take deep care, all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.